I sprayed her in the face with pepper spray before I even knew who she was. All I saw was a shadowy figure in leopard leggings halfway up my barn wall, 1 foot in a flower pot and one hand on my window frame, clutching what looked like a crowbar and a clipboard. That's the kind of thing that makes a man act first and ask questions later. I shouted, reached for the spray I keep by the back door, and let it rip straight through the open barn window. What followed was not the sound of a burglar falling to the ground, but the shriek of Karen from the HOA, gasping, sputtering, and demanding to know how I dared assault a board member on official business. It wasn't even 8:00 a.m., and my day had already become a disaster. The sheriff showed up 20 minutes later, thanks to Karen speed dialing 911 while tears and snot poured down her face like she'd been dunked in a wasabi fountain. To his credit, Sheriff Jackson didn't arrest me on the spot, though his expression said he'd like to. He leaned against his cruiser, arms crossed, while Karen went off like a sprinkler about legal rights of inspection and aesthetic violations on shared visual property. I didn't say much. I just stood there in my barn doorway, arms covered in sawdust, shirt half buttoned, wondering how it came to this. Karen claimed she had a legal right to inspect my barn because my red tin roof was visible from her backyard, and she believed it violated the HOA's regulation on reflective colors. I told her my barn wasn't within HOA jurisdiction, and I had the land deeds to prove it. That didn't stop her. She waved her clipboard like it was some sacred tablet, quoting bylaws and something about communal environment integrity. Jackson looked like he wanted to hand us both a citation just to be done with it. After he left, Karen stayed behind, sniffling, pacing, trying to pretend she wasn't still partially blind. She declared I would be receiving a formal notice from the HOA for aggressive behavior and property hostility. Then she turned and limped back to her car like a wounded flamingo. I watched her drive off, wheels sticking out half in the ditch, and finally let out the laugh I'd been holding in. I didn't feel bad about the pepper spray. If anything, I regretted not using the stronger can. The next day, the notice came, folded fancy letterhead like it was a bank loan offer and stamped with a gold HOA seal. It said I had been flagged for non-compliance with perimeter aesthetics, unauthorized building color, and the use of force against an HOA board member. It even threatened a monthly fine if I didn't cooperate with the oversight process. I nearly choked on my coffee. The barn they were complaining about had been built by my grandfather in 1961. It wasn't some pop-up shed. This barn had housed 5 generations of livestock, a couple of family fights, and even a small wedding reception when the community hall flooded back in 1984. My land sat just outside the HOA's defined perimeter. I made sure of that when I bought it. I liked my space, I liked my quiet, and I liked not having to ask permission every time I wanted to repaint my chicken coop or hang a new weather vane. But Karen, she liked power. And now, somehow, she thought she had some over me. 2 days after the letter, I saw her again. This time she wasn't climbing the barn. She was standing across the road with a pair of binoculars and a folding chair, like she was bird watching, except the only thing out there was me feeding the goats and fixing a fence post. I waved. She didn't wave back. That night, I called Mike, my lawyer and longtime friend. Mike laughed so hard he had to put the phone down. He called it a nonsense move and promised to get the proper property lines and jurisdiction documents in order. But he also warned me this wouldn't be the last time Karen tried something. He was right. The next morning, I woke up to find a small wooden stake driven into the ground on my property line with a laminated sign that read future site of HOA community garden expansion. No permit, no notices, just a sign, bold as brass. That's when it hit me. Karen wasn't just annoyed about my barn. She was trying to lay claim to it. At first, I figured maybe it was just her being overzealous, but when I confronted her, she smirked and told me the HOA had recently discovered an old plat map from the 1980s that suggested potential future annexation rights. She even said she was looking into historical claims that might grant the HOA certain oversight privileges on properties bordering its edge. I asked her if she was insane. She asked me if I planned to repaint the barn. The week continued like a comedy show. Karen left another sign out front, this one reading, "Pending Beautification Review." She started sending letters every other day, each one more ridiculous than the last. One complained about the barn's distracting roof line. Another insisted I cease livestock noises before 7 a.m., as if my rooster operated on a human schedule. I ignored most of it, but the straw that broke the camel's back came when I caught her again lurking near the side window, camera phone in hand, trying to get a photo inside the barn. That time, I didn't use pepper spray. I used the hose. She shrieked like I'd released a skunk and ran back across the field, drenched and fuming. I told her if she crossed my fence line again, I'd call the sheriff before the water even hit her. That night, I sat on the porch and watched the sun go down behind the barn. I didn't want trouble. I never asked for it, but it was clear Karen was just getting started. And if she thought I was going to roll over, she had another thing coming. That barn had stood longer than most of the houses in the HOA, and I wasn't about to let some clipboard-wielding tyrant rewrite history on my watch. Not without a fight. The very next morning, I met Mike at the county clerk's office. He had a manila folder so thick it looked like it had been plucked straight from a crime drama. Inside it were aerial maps, scanned deeds, plat maps from 1961 through 2022, and about 14 coffee-stained notes on Karen's nonsense. Mike was grinning the whole time, which made me nervous. He was enjoying this way too much. I knew Karen had made a mistake by trying to claim jurisdiction over my barn, but I didn't realize how deep her blunder went until Mike laid it all out. My property line was crystal clear. No ambiguity. No forgotten clauses. No easements. In fact, the HOA's founding documents stopped 3 lots short of my eastern fence. Karen had no more legal claim over my barn than she did over the moon. Mike said the issue wasn't legality. It was audacity. She was counting on me not knowing my rights, on wearing me down through paperwork and intimidation. Mike suggested we file an official cease and desist, but also warned that the process of getting the county to formally address boundary disputes could take a few weeks. In the meantime, he recommended I document everything: photos, videos, time-stamped logs. I went home that afternoon and installed 3 more cameras around the barn and 1 inside, hidden behind a stack of feed bags. If Karen wanted a war, I'd give her a surveillance-laced one. 2 days later, she escalated things in a way I never expected. I woke up to hammering, not your usual construction hammering either. Sharp, erratic, furious hammering that echoed across the property like someone trying to break into a safe with a rock. I got dressed and walked out to find Karen and 2 HOA volunteers, one of them her scrawny nephew I'd seen mowing her lawn before, installing what looked like a wooden viewing platform just beyond my fence. It had a crude ladder, a flat deck, and a little sign that read, "Community Observation Post." She called it a safety structure to observe potential fire hazards from my barn. I laughed when I saw it. That didn't sit well with Karen. She marched over to the fence and waved her hand in my face like she was shooing a fly. She said it was her duty as HOA president to keep the community safe from property risks, and that my barn with its ancient wiring and unapproved paint was a ticking time bomb. I told her the only bomb was the one going off in her head. Her volunteers looked like they were rethinking their life choices. I didn't touch the platform. I knew better than to do anything that could be twisted into destruction of HOA property. But I took pictures from every angle and emailed them to Mike. That evening, Karen returned with a folding chair, plopped herself onto the deck, and sat there for 2 straight hours watching my goats chew grass. She even brought binoculars, which made the whole thing look more like a bird-watching session hosted by a lunatic. One of my goats, Sherman, wandered over and stared at her for 20 minutes straight. I was proud of him. By now, the neighborhood had started to notice. Some of the HOA members who lived closer to me started slowing down as they passed, rubbernecking at the ridiculous platform. A few waved. One even rolled down their window and asked me if I was building a petting zoo. I told them it was just another fine HOA innovation and walked away. I didn't need sympathy. I needed witnesses. The next part hit harder. Karen started circulating a printed flyer. I found one stuck under my windshield at the local feed store. It said, "My neighbor is hiding unsafe structures and possibly illegal operations." It had a blurry photo of my barn taken from a ridiculous angle that made it look like it was leaning sideways. She also referenced code violations and the need for urgent inspection. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or rip the thing in half. I did both. Then I called Mike again. He said it was time to go on a fence. We prepared a formal response to the HOA, disputing their right to regulate anything on my property and attaching all legal documentation. But more importantly, Mike helped me draft a neighborhood memo of my own. Mine was simple, factual, and came with QR codes linking to the public deed documents and a photo of Karen perched in the observation post like a budget gargoyle. I called it Setting the Record Straight. I printed 50 copies and walked them door to door one evening, just before sunset. Most people were polite. A few were surprised. One man chuckled and told me his wife had always suspected Karen had too much time and too little sense. Another woman thanked me for finally pushing back. It felt like things were shifting, like the spell Karen had over the neighborhood was weakening. She had ruled with intimidation and fake rules for so long that people had forgotten she was just a neighbor with a title, not a queen with a crown. Then came the report to animal control. That one caught me off guard. I got home from the hardware store to find a white truck parked in my driveway with 2 officers walking the perimeter of my barn. They said they had received an anonymous tip about unsanitary conditions and distressed animals. I let them inside. My barn was clean, my goats were healthy, my chickens were squawking with the usual amount of attitude. They found nothing wrong but said they'd have to file a report anyway, just to log the complaint. I knew who made the call. There was no point in guessing. Karen had turned from nuisance to full-blown saboteur, and she wasn't letting up. I walked into the barn that night, looked up at the rafters where the old security camera now blinked red, and made a decision. I wasn't going to play defense anymore. If she wanted a show, I was going to give her one, and the next time she stepped foot on my land without permission, she'd be leaving with more than just wet clothes. The week began with an absurd sight that would have been funny if it wasn't so infuriating. A line of folding chairs stretched along my fence, all occupied by a cluster of Karen's most loyal HOA followers, each holding a clipboard like it was some kind of sacred relic. At the front stood Karen herself, arms raised like a preacher, shouting into a megaphone. A banner hung across 2 garden stakes, "Emergency HOA Assembly." I couldn't make out every word she was saying, but I caught phrases like hazard proximity, barn structure, and visual disruption to community harmony. I leaned on the post by my gate, arms crossed, watching this carnival unfold like it was free entertainment. I half expected someone to start selling popcorn. I walked down to the end of my driveway, boots crunching against the gravel. Karen spotted me and turned up the volume. She pointed at me like she was summoning the devil and accused me of resisting cooperative improvement efforts. I asked her if she had a permit to hold an assembly on private land. She said the edge of my driveway counted as common community access because it connected to a county-maintained road. I told her she was 2 fence posts away from trespassing and that the goats were getting hungry. That got her to step back, but the damage was done. Half the neighborhood had seen it, and by sundown, there were whispers everywhere. Later that night, after I'd fed the goats and locked the barn, I found another notice taped to my gate. This one was from the HOA's Violation Enforcement Committee. It cited unauthorized land usage, non-compliance with visual uniformity standards, and aggressive language toward a board member during an HOA function. I almost laughed, but instead, I took it inside and added it to my growing stack of nonsense in a file labeled Karen's Greatest Hits. The next morning brought an even bigger surprise. I returned from the feed store to find a white truck in my driveway again, but it wasn't animal control this time. It was a city zoning inspector. Karen had filed a formal complaint claiming I had converted the barn into a commercial structure without permit. She alleged I was operating a black market butchery based on the fact that I had recently had a freezer delivered and the noise of tools had been reported by neighbors. The inspector was polite, maybe even a little embarrassed, and asked if I minded showing him around. I opened the barn doors, waved him inside, and let him see the so-called black market setup. He found a few feed bags, a row of chicken coops, and my nephew's workbench, where he'd been building a new door for the chicken pen. That was it. No meat, no strange wiring, no shady operations, just a barn, a few chickens, 2 goats, and a whole lot of country living. He nodded, took a few photos for the file, and said he'd make a note that everything was in order. Before he left, he turned to me and said he'd seen this kind of thing before. One person with too much time, too little sense, and a grudge. I didn't even have to say her name. It was then that I decided to get serious about documentation. I reviewed every clip from the cameras I'd installed, and it didn't take long to find what I needed. 2 nights prior, around 2:30 in the morning, Karen had approached the barn again. She was dressed in all black, carrying a flashlight and what looked like a tape measure. She paced the exterior of the barn, stopped to jot something down, then tried the side door. The alarm I had rigged didn't go off because she didn't pull the handle hard enough, but the footage was clear. She had no business being there. I downloaded the video, marked the timestamp, and sent it straight to Mike. He replied with one line, "Time to make this public." That afternoon, I uploaded the footage to the neighborhood Facebook group with a simple caption, "Unauthorized inspection attempt by HOA president at 2:30 a.m. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. Within hours, the post had exploded. Dozens of comments came in from neighbors, some shocked, some furious, and a few gleefully amused. One woman said she always knew Karen was a busybody, but never thought she'd sneak around like a burglar. Another neighbor said he'd caught her peeking over his fence once but hadn't said anything. Now he wished he had. Karen tried to respond in the comments, claiming the footage was fake and taken out of context, but her comment only made things worse. People started screenshotting her message threads, posting past HOA notices that matched her handwriting, and even one neighbor dug up an old newsletter where Karen claimed her actions were always done with transparency and daylight visibility. The hypocrisy was too much to ignore. The neighborhood, once docile under her rule, was turning on her. The real turning point came 2 days later, when the sheriff returned. But this time, he wasn't here for me. He knocked on Karen's door, stood with her for about 15 minutes, and then walked back to his cruiser with a folder in hand. The rumors spread fast. Karen had been issued a formal warning for trespassing and harassment, and if another complaint was filed, she could face a restraining order. It wasn't jail time, but it was something. A crack in the armor she had worn so smugly for years. By the end of the week, the observation post had been taken down, the chairs disappeared, and for the first time in weeks, there were no flyers on my gate. I sat on my porch that evening, coffee in hand, listening to the goats fussing in the barn and the breeze rustling the leaves overhead. Karen had pushed too far, and now she was scrambling. But I knew it wasn't over. People like her don't back off quietly. They regroup, they scheme, and then they come back with twice the fire. But this time, I was ready. The cameras were rolling, the lawyer was on standby, and if Karen wanted to climb back into the mess she'd made, she'd find the barn door locked, the fence reinforced, and the spray can still within arm's reach. The tension simmered for a couple of days after the sheriff's visit. Karen stayed mostly out of sight, which was a welcome change from her usual antics. But I knew better than to think she had given up. People like Karen don't just disappear. They regroup and come back louder, with more paperwork and worse ideas. So when I saw a brand new flyer posted on the neighborhood community board near the mailboxes, I wasn't surprised. What did catch me off guard was the title printed at the top in oversized letters, "Restoring Order to a Chaotic Quartier." Beneath it was a poorly edited image of my barn with a red X over the roof and a speech bubble that read, "Hey, is there the zone?" The rest of the flyer was full of Karen's usual fear-mongering, claiming that my barn was a threat to neighborhood values, and that the HOA would soon be voting on a resolution to petition the county for enforcement privileges over properties deemed visually disruptive to community cohesion. That was a mouthful of nonsense, but it was also a warning. She was doubling down. I pulled the flyer off the board and tossed it into the passenger seat of my truck. That evening, I scanned it and sent it to Mike with a subject line that read, "She's still kicking." He called back within the hour, laughing again, but not with the same ease as before. He told me she was digging herself a deeper hole, but warned that if she got the HOA to back her resolution, even symbolically, it could create a long-term headache. It wouldn't be legally binding on my land, but it would stir more drama and give her another excuse to harass me under the guise of community action. I asked what we should do next. Mike's voice lowered, serious now. Make the town see who she really is. So I started collecting testimonials. I quietly reached out to neighbors who had commented on the surveillance footage. One older couple who lived near the HOA's boundary line admitted Karen had once fined them for having a holiday wreath up too long after New Year's. Another neighbor shared a story about Karen reporting his teenage daughter for parking on the street overnight during winter break. Story after story rolled in, and I wrote them down, every word. I wasn't interested in shaming her publicly, but I wanted to be ready if she tried anything bigger. And she did. The next week brought the cherry on top. I woke up to a sharp bang at my gate. I stepped out in my boots, coffee still in hand, and saw a uniformed man holding a clipboard. He wasn't from the city or the county. He introduced himself as a private contractor hired by the HOA to conduct a third-party safety assessment. According to him, the HOA had authorized a visual inspection of my barn to determine if it posed a structural risk to the surrounding area. I almost laughed, but instead asked if he had a warrant or any kind of legal authorization to step onto my land. He didn't. I told him to leave and advised him that if he came back without proper documentation, he'd be escorted off by the sheriff. The man didn't argue. He just nodded, looked uncomfortable, and walked back to his van. Later that day, I checked my cameras again and found the footage of his visit. I downloaded it and uploaded a short clip to the neighborhood group, captioned, "The HOA just hired a stranger to inspect my barn without permission. This isn't safety, this is harassment." The comments exploded again, this time with more people expressing concern than humor. One resident said they had received a survey asking whether they supported increased oversight on non-member properties. Another said she'd felt pressured to attend the HOA assembly near my gate out of fear her own garden might get flagged. The tide was fully turning. And then came the leak. One of the HOA board members, a man named Doug who had kept mostly quiet through the chaos, sent me a message. He attached screenshots from the HOA internal message board where Karen had not only planned the unauthorized surveillance, but also made it clear she was attempting to create pressure until I either complied or moved. Her words, not mine. Mike was thrilled. He said that was more than enough for legal action if I wanted it. But I wasn't looking to sue. I was looking to expose. So I added those screenshots to the neighborhood group, letting the images speak for themselves. The reaction was fast and fierce. By that evening, several members had called for an emergency HOA board meeting, without Karen present. Apparently, this wasn't the first time she had taken action without approval. Her power was slipping, and for once, she didn't know how to stop it. The next day, she tried to post her own video, a shaky cell phone rant about property values and community threat. But by then, the damage was done. Nobody was listening. One woman commented under the video and simply wrote, "You got caught." That summed it up perfectly. When the sheriff returned, it was just to confirm the boundaries of the restraining order. Karen was formally barred from approaching my property line without my written permission. She wasn't arrested, but it was the next best thing. Her observation post was dismantled, the folding chairs disappeared, the flyers stopped. For the first time in months, my barn stood quiet, undisturbed, and still bright red. I spent that weekend fixing the garden fence, repainting the chicken coop, and finally replacing the broken hinge on the barn door. I hadn't realized how much her antics had pulled me away from the work I love. The goats were happier, the chickens louder, and the property felt like it belonged to me again. A couple of neighbors dropped by just to chat, which hadn't happened in years. One even brought over a pie and said, "Thank you for standing up." I told her I was just protecting my goats, but the truth was, It felt good knowing others were watching and cheering from behind their fences. Karen hadn't vanished completely. I'd still see her once in a while, driving past in her silver SUV, staring straight ahead like I didn't exist. But she didn't stop. She didn't honk. She didn't wave. That alone was a victory. I knew better than to relax fully. People like her never give up entirely. They just wait. But now the barn had cameras. I had proof. The sheriff was on my side, and the community had found its voice again. If she wanted another round, she'd find it was a whole new game. The special HOA hearing was scheduled for a Thursday evening in the local community center, the kind of building that still smelled like cleaning spray and old coffee. I wasn't technically part of the HOA, but since my name had been dragged through the mud in every flyer and megaphone session Karen had orchestrated, I was invited as a guest speaker. Mike came with me, dressed in his usual half-casual, half-serious lawyer outfit and carrying a leather folder filled with everything from legal maps to signed witness statements. I didn't say much on the drive over. I didn't have to. By this point, the truth was a freight train, and Karen was standing right in its path with a whistle and no clue what was coming. The room was packed. Folding chairs filled every corner, people lining the walls and peeking through the doorways. Karen sat at the center table with her usual smug look, hair styled a little too tightly, clipboard in hand like it was a courtroom exhibit. She had prepared a presentation. She always did. This one had a title slide projected on the wall behind her, Preserving Property Standards and Safety. I nearly snorted when I saw it. She opened by thanking everyone for attending, then immediately launched into a speech about neighborhood stability, the need for oversight in bordering properties, and her vision for a unified aesthetic landscape. She even brought out a laser pointer and gestured to a blown-up photo of my barn with a giant red arrow pointing at the roof. She said it was disruptive to the neighborhood's natural color palette. Then she played the victim, claiming she had only tried to help, only tried to guide the community through visual harmony and functional order. She said she had been attacked, vilified, and unjustly restrained from doing her duty. Then it was my turn. I walked up slow, took a moment to look around the room, and didn't even bother with the microphone. I thanked them for allowing me to speak and then turned to face Karen. I asked her one question. Do you know how many times you stepped on my land without permission this year? She said she had acted within perceived jurisdiction and community concern. I nodded, then pulled out a printed sheet. 14 times. Documented, time-stamped, and recorded. 14 illegal trespasses. I laid the sheet on the table in front of her. She didn't touch it. Then I turned to the projector and held up a large aerial map of the neighborhood. I pointed to my parcel, outlined in blue, and explained that not only was I outside the HOA jurisdiction, but the original founding agreement for the association made it explicitly clear that my land was excluded due to its agricultural designation. I read the clause out loud. Karen looked down. Some of the people in the room leaned in closer. Mike stood up and distributed copies of the deed to anyone who wanted one. A few hands went up immediately. I could have stopped there, but I didn't. I told them about the late-night fence inspections, the observation post, the unauthorized contractor she sent, the flyers, the false animal control report. I held up one of the flyers, read it word for word, and then showed the camera footage of Karen measuring my barn in the middle of the night. Gasps rippled through the room. It wasn't anger at me they felt. It was realization. They had been following someone who had gone too far for too long. I saw it on their faces, the shift, the shame, the recognition. Mike stepped forward then and delivered the final blow. He passed around a document stating the formal boundaries recognized by the county office, signed and notarized just 3 days prior. Then he read from a legal letter drafted that morning, a cease and desist order with attached evidence, ready to file in court if any further harassment occurred. Karen tried to interrupt him, but this time no one backed her up. Her voice faltered when she realized she didn't have the room anymore. And then, in the biggest twist of the night, Greg stood up. Greg was an older man, retired firefighter, and one of the original founders of the HOA. He hadn't spoken much in the past few meetings, but now he cleared his throat and asked for everyone's attention. He admitted that Karen had approached him months ago asking about old maps and unrecorded boundaries. She had pitched an idea to him about expanding the HOA's reach and eventually building a new community center on what she referred to as available land. Greg told her it wasn't available. It was mine. She didn't care. She believed that if she pushed hard enough, filed enough complaints, and made my life difficult, I'd either sell out or stop resisting. She wanted to annex my land for a clubhouse and extra parking. It was never about roof colors or goats. It was about greed. The room was silent after Greg spoke. Then someone clapped, and then a few more. I didn't join in. I just stood there, staring at Karen as her empire crumbled around her. She looked like a statue, mouth tight, eyes glassy. The HOA board voted that night. Not only was her proposal to expand oversight denied, but a motion was passed to remove her from her position as HOA president. It wasn't even close. 5 votes to 0. Karen walked out without a word, her clipboard tucked under her arm like a child's toy. I watched her go, not out of spite, but because it felt like the end of a very long and ridiculous chapter. Mike patted me on the back. Greg shook my hand. A few neighbors stayed behind just to talk, to say they were sorry they hadn't spoken up sooner, to tell me they'd supported me now. I didn't need their apologies, but I accepted them. People learn, sometimes too late, but better late than never. That night, I sat on my porch with a glass of sweet tea, the barn glowing soft in the moonlight, the goats asleep, the air still. For the first time in a long while, the world felt quiet, peaceful, like things were where they should be. I knew Karen wasn't finished forever, but she was done here, and that was enough. After the hearing, the change around the neighborhood was almost immediate. People walked slower past my gate, not because they were snooping, but because they finally felt like they could. One neighbor even stopped by just to say he appreciated how I handled everything with calm and facts, which made me chuckle because I remembered the pepper spray incident like it was yesterday. Calm wasn't exactly the word I would have used, but I let him have it. There was a different energy in the air now. Karen's grip had loosened. The flyers stopped. The sneaky snapshots ended. And best of all, that ridiculous observation post was gone, replaced by a patch of bare dirt that reminded everyone what happens when control turns into obsession. I spent the first week of peace fixing the little things. I replaced the broken lock on the side barn door with a sturdier one, reinforced the main gate with a heavier chain, and adjusted the camera angles so I had full visibility of every entrance, not because I expected more trouble, but because old habits die hard. I reseeded part of the field that had been trampled during the surveillance drama and finally rebuilt the fence section that Karen's nephew knocked loose months ago when setting up their platform. My nephew helped me repaint the side of the barn, not because it needed it, but because I wanted it to look fresh. I picked the same red, the same shade Karen hated, just a little brighter. About a week after Karen disappeared from public view, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. It was a short note that simply said, "You might have won this time, but don't think I'm going away." There was no signature, but the ink smelled like the same cheap perfume she always wore to HOA meetings. I didn't show Mike the letter. I didn't call the sheriff. I tossed it into the fireplace and watched it curl into ash. Whatever she meant by going away, I figured it wouldn't matter now. She had lost her title, her influence, and whatever strange army of clipboard carriers she used to command. The new HOA board reached out about a week later. One of the members, a younger guy named Eric, called to apologize on behalf of the group. He said the board had let things go on too long and admitted they had been intimidated by Karen's energy and persistence. He asked if we could meet to talk through some boundaries and agreements moving forward. I agreed. We sat at the town diner for breakfast, and I explained my position clearly. I didn't want to fight the HOA. I just didn't want them on my land, near my barn, or involved in anything that didn't concern them legally. Eric nodded and said that was more than fair. He even suggested we draft a mutual respect agreement so that in future misunderstandings, we would both know where to draw the line. I signed it without hesitation. He left with a handshake and a promise that the new board would respect boundaries. For the first time, I actually believed it. Around the same time, I heard something interesting from a local realtor who stopped by to buy eggs from my neighbor. She mentioned, offhandedly, that Karen used to dabble in real estate and had been quietly working with a developer to push property values higher in the area. Her plan had been to target outlier properties, like mine, either force them into compliance or create enough pressure that the owners would sell, making space for higher value homes. I nearly laughed when I heard that. All those rants about visual disruption and safety hazards weren't about the barn at all. It was about profit. She wasn't preserving the neighborhood. She was trying to flip it. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me oddly satisfied. The plan had failed. The barn still stood, and Karen was out. I decided to mark the occasion in my own small way. I've been thinking about getting another goat ever since the whole mess began, not because I needed one, but because I figured after all this, I deserved a little mischief that I could actually control. I drove out to a nearby farm and found her. A scrappy little white goat with one floppy ear and a stubborn streak so strong she nearly broke out of the pen just while I was signing the paperwork. I brought her home in the back of my truck and introduced her to Sherman and the rest of the bunch. She fit right in, raising chaos and chewing everything in sight. I named her Karen. It felt only right. Karen the goat turned out to be more destructive than the real Karen ever was. She knocked over a paint can, chewed through a wire I had to re-splice twice, and somehow managed to get on top of the hay bale stack even though I never saw how. But I didn't mind. Every time I called her name, I smiled. This Karen didn't demand inspection reports. She just wanted food, attention, and the occasional scratch behind the ear. And unlike her namesake, she didn't hold grudges. Spring turned to summer, and the barn stood peaceful. The grass grew back. The neighborhood settled. A few kids started walking past in the evenings again, waving as they went. One even asked if he could take pictures of the goats for a school project. I let him. Another neighbor brought over cookies and said she had nominated the barn for a local preservation photo series. She called it the heart of the neighborhood. That nearly got a laugh out of me, but I just nodded and said, "Thank you." In the quiet moments, I thought about everything that had happened, the chaos, the lies, the paperwork, the hearings. It all seemed like a storm that had passed, and though I didn't go looking for that storm, I had weathered it. Karen had underestimated a simple truth. You don't push a man off his land and expect him to fall. You don't climb into his barn and expect him to stay quiet. And you sure don't mess with someone who has pepper spray, a lawyer on speed dial, and a goat named after you. One evening, as the sun dropped low behind the hills and painted the sky with gold, I sat on the porch, a glass of cold tea in one hand, and watched Karen the goat headbutt a feed bucket into the fence. I didn't stop her. I just let her be. That barn had seen storms before, and it would see them again. But tonight, the only thing raising a fuss was a stubborn little goat with no interest in bylaws or property values, and that was just fine by me.